But it's kind of funny, just as like I finish my book comes out, and my book is High Weirdness is based on my dissertation, which I did going to the university and blah, 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 that as that finishes, I also feel like I'm sort of done with the way that I've been doing the podcast now. So I'm actually gonna take a couple of months off this summer, and I do it almost weekly, and take some time off, and then just kind of in a way ask what you're asking. It's like I want to feel like if I'm continue to do this, that I may need to shift it functionally in some ways just to change it up a bit, but more about having a bit more of a targeted sense of what I'm doing, which doesn't mean the guests aren't going to be as eclectic, but just something a little bit less indulgent, or just how do I feel about what I'm doing and how I'm intervening, because the public environment within which our podcasts get distributed and listened to and commented on, that whole domain is so fucking different and so fucked up and so, damaged and bizarre, and helping us, bringing us to various cliffs, that it requires, I think, a different kind of focus. And one more thing that I would say about that was interesting, that I think may, give us a kind of a line in, is who are my listeners? Like, what are they, who's the sort of generic listener, not the people I know personally, or the people I have a connection with, like you, and that we don't talk very much, but you're in my kind of matrix, my field. And there's those people I know, other podcasters, thinkers, whatever, writers. And then there's people who just listen, most of whom I don't know at all. And over time, I've gotten a better sense from getting email, from running into people, from talking to people, of who those people are. And one thing that I would say is that they're often young men, generally white men, who have a scientific or skeptical basis or a temperament. They come from that perspective, but they're very interested in these more otherworldly topics: psychedelics, the occult, conspiracy theory, weird, they're interested, but they're wary of the way that most people present those things. It seems a little too, not quite trustworthy. And they like me because I carry a lot of, whatever you want to call it, what remains of quote unquote common sense, but a kind of skepticism, a kind of critical humanities approach that puts things in context. But I also take the phenomena really seriously, like not necessarily literally, but very seriously, and not in just a way to like banish it or whatever. So that's part of my tightrope, is this balance. And so in relation to conspiracy theory, it's not so much that I don't believe, I do have a lot of beliefs about why the way a lot of people construct conspiracy theory is not very persuasive. So I have concepts about the theories themselves and where they sort of fall short. But in other ways, I'm quite sympathetic with a fair amount of it, and particularly around the stuff that you do: ideological control, belief manufacture, that kind of stuff, mind control types of things, because it's in the records, it's in the histories, it's in, if they're going to try to do it, of course they're going to try to do it. So let's look at it. So I am sympathetic with a lot of that stuff, but it's also that I feel like I have kind of a code of intellectual ethics about how I proceed in relationship to certain kinds of beliefs. And even if they're possibly true in some ways, I'm also believe there is a reason to maintain a certain kind of relation to those truths. And ultimately in terms of a kind of pragmatics, like how do you live your life? And here I would maybe make an analogy. Like you could say, like, okay, you start to go down a path, you start to believe more, you start to see more and more evidence for a certain kind of mind control, direct ideological manipulation. You have certain ideas about what the agendas behind those things are, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, it can get so bad that you can barely kind of function through your ordinary day, because everything you look at is sort of a sign of this process that's happening. And for me, when I see that, I can see a couple things. One is that it's often very similar to how people convert to religion and deal with religious ideas and deal with mystical ideas. And so the kind of connection between a real world political account of hidden forces and a religious, mystical, esoteric account of hidden forces are often extremely similar, in fact, frequently overlap.
Yeah.
And so that already is like, okay, so we're not just talking about a claim about the world. We're also talking about a kind of process that involves these other these other domains. And I mean, I could say other stuff, but I've been talking for a while, so that's just one place to start. So when I see that pattern, the same part of me that's interested in religion as both a kind of critic or skeptic, and as someone who's kind of interested in the experiences and the way these worlds unfold, that just sort of naturally pops up in my head in relationship to the material. So.
Right. Well, that's certainly one of the areas I thought we might get into today, but I want to pull back before we do, if we do, because it is such a huge subject. And at what point, I mean, just briefly, at what point does the research, the fact-based research, start bleeding over into metaphysical theories? Because metaphysics is always theoretical, right? We can't just refer to the records there. I mean, there's esoteric literature, but that's not the same. It's not fact-based in the same way, right? But there's no clear dividing line between the historical, present-day research, which can start with the most mundane and the most profane. What I would call organized crime is embedded throughout our culture in all the different institutions, is my view. And then that overlaps with espionage, which overlaps with secret societies, which overlaps with metaphysics, right? It's this spectrum. So, yeah, absolutely. Enter the chapel perilous with absolute caution, fear and awareness. It's not to be done rationally. And, not many people do make it through. And we see this, same with ufology, same with religion, same with, I would say, spirituality, same with psychedelics. My view is all of these are kind of different wings of chapel perilous, and very few make it through. It just seems to be the nature of the game. So, but to bring it, I said I was going to step back, but that was just, kind of summation of the big picture. But to bring it back to the personal, which is always safer ground, it's interesting, I mean, because I feel there's a sort of symmetry between you and I, which I've been intuiting, while thinking about talking to you, in terms of a couple of things. One, your relationship to your audience and mine, which maybe I'll get to, but specifically around conspiracy, in quotes, how we approach it or how we don't. Because I wrote a bunch of books, at least a couple anyway, under the pseudonym Eos Cephas, which were, in a sense, they were conspiracy hard, or the opposite of light. They were full on kind of conspiracy theory. Now, I kind of couched it in a postmodernist sort of what if kind of thing. So I put everything like the paranoid believes this and the paranoid believes that, as in this is a set of beliefs. But essentially I believed those things at the time. And at the same time, I was very naive in retrospect about where I was getting my information. Like I was relying on all kinds of sources like Strieber or Castaneda or Steiner or, any number of, they're still better than average. They're not Alex Jones or David Icke, but nonetheless highly questionable and embedded in, I would say, a much deeper conspiracy, in quotes, of social engineering, cultural manufacture of narratives, and so on. So anyway, I entered into that very naively. I drank the Kool-Aid, to use an unfortunate metaphor, because I don't believe that narrative either. And I ended up writing books, that were propagating memes that I had imbibed, rashly, without really thinking it through, without reading the ingredients. But something happened in the last 10 years, but particularly the last 5 years, I guess, since we met around that time, Crucial Fiction's time, and it started to become personal. And I'd actually kind of backed away from conspiracy stuff, but something pulled me back in, and I could say it was this or that. There would be few things. One of the most obvious things was Jimmy Savile. That whole thing came out about Jimmy Savile. He's a Yorkshire man. I grew up imbibing Jimmy Savile. My wife kept saying, you need to look more into Jimmy Savile. You need to, and it went on for months, and I was quite resistant. I was quite irritable about it as well. Why do you keep making me want to go into all this dark stuff? But when I did, and it was also in the context of my brother's death in 2010 and trying to understand that. So really, well, it took him 10 years, but it was a slow process. When I did, everything changed, just as for many people, well, not many, but some people in England, Jimmy Savile was like for some Americans, Donald Trump is, in a totally different way. It was a game changer. It reconfigured the landscape, what came out about Jimmy Savile, about the organized crime and just how prevalent it is institutionally. As I went through that process, and I've been going through it, my last two books specifically, the whole, and I'll kind of just crunch it down to a soundbite now, the whole paradigm shifted from conspiracy to complicity. The understanding more and more that the nature of what I'd mapped as a conspiracy, naively using the same cognitive tools that had been indoctrinated in me by the conspiracy, quote unquote, to interpret it in a way that would keep me enmeshed in it, entrapped by it, had, shaped my own interests and my own behaviors and made me complicit with something. Therefore, there was no way to draw a line and say, this is them and this is us, and this is what I need to do to get free of it. No, it was metaphysical at that point. The only way to get free of this is to go inward and see how my whole psyche's been reconfigured through these traumatic programs of mind control and abuse and cultural narrative, a whole, whatever, a matrix, right? A kind of a literal experiential version of the matrix. So that's been a radical shift. And so I'm in a very weird place now where I'm just as skeptical about the conspiracy theorists like Alex Jones. Not that I wasn't always skeptical about him because he's so mainstream, but I mean, even the narratives he's peddling, even though they seem to me to be 90% true, I can't believe any of it because the way they're being framed. So I'm just as skeptical there as I am about the people who are saying, nothing going on here, the CIA would never, whatever, I'm liminal. So, but that seems to be part of I guess, suppose the razor's edge or the eye of the needle or the tightrope that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm talking about. I mean, and I think we come at it different ways. I mean, in a way, your your upbringing and your own unusual history, which is very obviously of central importance to you, and as and your own move towards realizing that you can't think about this stuff unless you are also doing some kind of psychological inquiry or some kind of uncovering, because this stuff is designed, and especially the kind of mainstream conspiracy stuff is designed to elicit affect, elicit psychological motivations, unspoken feelings, fears, desires, and organize them in a particular way. And that's very visible in, that's like right-wing radio. What is right-wing radio? Not even just the conspiracy stuff. It's like putting forward ideas that allow and justify the listener to feel, bitterness, frustration, resentment, anger, and fear. And so they're kind of like affect engines. And so you can analyze them in the level of talk and concept and content. And there's this, it's true, this isn't true, da, 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 da. Fine. But what's real on some level, on other level, what's really going on is just this immense affect machine. So if you start to go on these wayward routes and really start taking things seriously to the point where you have to start questioning yourself and your own ideas, because what if that really was a form of social programming and not this thing that I'm coming from, and it's not so innocent, and actually these guys were working together and blah, blah, blah. As you go down there, there's a lot of emotions that inevitably start coming up because you're peeling back the surface. There's a psychological dynamic to it. But when I meet most and talk to most conspiracy people, read a lot of stuff about this stuff. And I'm fairly familiar with a lot, at least of the major arcs of the stories. I often sense, and it's almost an intuitive sense, that's the same sense that makes me go, oh no, Jason, he's an ethical person. He's really on the path. He's struggling in a way that's very vulnerable, in a way that I can really connect with. That same part of me senses a lot of people who are in denial, who do not recognize the psychological dimension of it, the harrowing psychological dimension of it, because once you start unraveling that stuff, then you're in all this other stuff that can mire you and confuse you, or, it's rough. It's not an easy thing to do. And that whole thing about complicity really resonated with me, because at first, when you said complicity instead of conspiracy, I was thinking what you meant was that the kinds of social or phenomena that are recognized by some people as evidence of a conspiracy is really more accurately described as a form of complicity, and that I would mostly agree with in the objective sense, that a lot of the time what looks like this maybe is like a master plot where everyone's sitting down and they're planning exactly how to do this thing and it's going to unfold just as they plan. I don't think that happens very often. I don't think that's how history works. I don't think that's how institutions work. And that's one of my main critiques of a lot of conspiracy narratives. I just don't think the world works with that degree of control. But along the way, a lot of the same things effectively happen because everybody's kind of complicit. They're going along with the process. Like, sure, yeah, let's try that. Okay. Oh, let's take advantage of that. Oh, that happened. Let's do it right away. And, it's actually the same kind of stuff often. It's just not as controlled in a top-down way. And I can explain more what I mean by that if that's unclear. But the point then is listening to you and then going, oh wait, no, but what he's talking about is complicity, his complicity. And then I'm like, and then what about my complicity? And I sit with my complicity a lot. I mean, I've often thought about you, actually, the way you turned away from your wealth and your status and really make that turn. I mean, that to my mind is like one of these acts of someone that I know personally is both, outrageous, brilliantly ethical, totally mad, and I can't wrap it and put it in any one package, but it definitely, it's definitely a form of non-complicity, whatever it is. And so I really admire that. And I often ask myself, well, actually, I have privilege. I went to a Ivy League university, and I think even about a lot of ideas, both my resistance and even my resistance to some conspiratorial accounts have to do with just my social location and my own wovenness in the system. Like I didn't make that break that you did. I did not kill the father in that way. Like my father is literally a scientist who works on climate stuff. So and I remember, that was one of the things when I was thinking back to Mexico that you expressed skepticism about climate change. And this really pissed off Daniel Pinchbeck, who went apoplectic, which is kind of funny to see him do. And I've met climate change deniers, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But like, I can't be sort of honestly who I am and support that skepticism in the sense that not just on an intellectual point of view, but like I'm embedded in a network where like I know my father and I know about how scientific institutions work because I know a lot of scientists and I have certain ideas about how scientific facts get produced and they're rickety. It's not as clear as we would like it to be. There's a whole politics and there are games going on. There always are, but I can't, it's just too crude for me because of where I sit and because I never like killed the father. I never broke with the university system, the academic system, critical theory, certain idea of science. Like I'm more woven into them. And so sometimes I reflect on myself and I go, I have like 1 foot in and 1 foot out. That's kind of my place. Like I'm liminal in a different way than you. I think you're more like capital L liminal. And I'm just sort of like, I sort of live on the liminal because of this sort of position that I've set up for myself. But in some ways it's kind of controlled. And so sometimes I go, I am complicit because I, in the end, am still just functioning as a fringe operator in this system that I'm still helping to reproduce in some way, or another. And that's one of my forms of like looking at my own complicity, as well as emotional ones. Like I said before about, I know that my own attraction to some conspiracy is precisely because it brings me a emotional flavor of something I want and fear at the same time, with this sense of being whatever, a puppet of forces. And it's like both delicious and terrifying. And there's something in it that's very affective to me, that's in my dreams, it's in the patterns of my desire. And I'm just not even really sure necessarily what to do with it. So I actually steer away from certain things, partly because I don't like, it's too much, like too emotionally challenging for me. But I also keep them around for precisely those reasons. Like, I don't close the door. I'm not interested in just straight out denial. I'm interested in seeing how the stories evolve, and particularly ones that are sophisticated, that yours, that have reflexivity. They don't have reflexivity, then I'm not that interested in them after a certain point, because they're naive. But when there's reflexivity in them, and it's like there's some reflection about how information works to produce the effect, and then you realize you're in the loop, and how do we get out of the loop, and you're proceeding on that in that way. Well, that's a lot more kind of simpatico. But there's still some like emotional shoals, or abysses that are conjured up in me, partly because I have a paranoid temperament, that I can smell, like I recognize, and I'm like, okay, just step very lightly here. Don't want to close your eyes, but you don't want to necessarily dive in certain ways, because I've seen what I've done sometimes in distorting my own beliefs about the world, and heartfelt beliefs that I've come to, not things that I'm just automatically reproducing, precisely by kind of infection with paranoid memes.
Mm. So it's like you've covered two things there, as I heard. One was what you just summed up there, this kind of push-pull relationship to paranoid awareness, as they call it, and awareness to getting sucked in. But before that, you were talking about your complicity, or the possibility of complicity, which I inferred from that, and this would be universal anyway, it wouldn't be specific to you, but a recognition of yourself, of a tendency, an inevitable tendency to not want to see certain realities or aspects about the institutions, figuratively and literally, that you're embedded in, right? That you are consciously complicit with, because you see them as benign. And if you were to see them as not benign, or if you were to see aspects that were less benign, then your complicity would become obviously more problematic. So then there would have to be an unconscious complicity, because you wouldn't want to be consciously complicit with something that wasn't benign, right? And that, there's something that you brought up in one of the conversations you sent me. It was this question you had. It was a rhetorical one, really, with Dusty Atlas, but you were wondering, what is it about conspiracy theories? You have to put the scare quotes there, because I think you at least know the idea that the whole term conspiracy theory itself is a conspiracy, right?
No, I buy that. I do. Just to interrupt for a moment, it is unfortunate I do talk about this stuff at some length in high weirdness, and I've done my most sort of concerted thinking and writing about conspiracy in that book. And one of the things I tell is that, sort of the origin story of the term, and how it's deployed, and how it's used to obfuscate and all that. Okay. So I think
good. Let's throw it out then. I use parapolitics, I use organized crime, I use social engineering, sociocultural engineering. We're talking about deeply embedded, programs and agendas that are shaping society and individuals as we know them, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, your rhetorical question was, you read some of the material that other people read, and you see things that's maybe true and not true, and you remain objective about it. But other people, they seem to just take it on, and you were questioning, what is that? What is it that switches the switch in their brain, where they just become completely behind whatever it is, whatever theory it is? And it's not always theory, of course. Sometimes it is just alternate history. But anyway, and it occurred to me, thinking about that this very much refers to what you're talking about here, I think, is that a large factor in that is what world are we embedded in, what circles do we move in, because we're mimetic creatures, right? We behave, not I would say not even primarily, unless we really have developed very far, not even primarily on an internal autonomous orientation, but through observation, imitation, what passes, what's going to fly, and you're embedded in a very different world than I am. I'm very much in the conspiracy culture. I'd say I'm in up to my neck pretty much in it. And but I think that does go back also, like you're inferring, to my childhood. I mean, we were maybe raised in a similar environment in terms of privilege, but I never took to it. Like, even as a child, I didn't feel good about it. There was no way I was ever going to follow my father's footsteps. There was no way I was ever not going to try to kill him, right? For whatever reason, the blueprint that I was installed with very early on was self-marginalization, rejection, rebellion, opposition. And that did lead to the throwing away the money in the most grandiose act, but that was quite unconscious. You're right, in that mix of different motivations you put together. Ethical was the least of it, really. In retrospect, I could see that it was an unconscious attempt to be ethical, but I sure as hell wasn't thinking about it at the time. I just wanted to get free of something, and I didn't know how. It's only in recent years that I began to see, what that money was part of, and geopolitics and social engineering and all kinds of, organized abuse of children. I mean, I don't want to overstate it. I don't know how directly involved my family was, but again, this complicity, this spectrum of overlapping spheres of social control and influence, that the money came out of that. So yeah, I was driven to get free of something, and that was the first unconscious gesture, the most literal effort to do so. And it's only become conscious in recent years. And if I could kind of bring it back again to specifics, like our personal approach to how we do what we do, it's become particularly manifest in the last couple of years, even via the growing sense of who my audience is. What circle am I moving in, right? Because we create the circles we move in as well. We don't just get as we develop autonomy, we're more and more creating the circles, picking it, choosing them, influencing anyway, the way we move in the world, but still somewhat unconsciously, and that's part of how we become more conscious. And so one of the things I do with my podcast, I don't know if you know or not, is I also talk to my listeners. It's open, and anyone can come on my podcast if they want to. They might not make the cut, although everybody has so far. Anyone wants to take the plunge, they can go through the fourth wall. And I want to talk to my listeners. And one of the things I've discovered through the feedback, but also through talking to people for the podcast, is the kind of people I'm attracting. And it struck me when you were talking about your audience, it's almost like the opposite image of that. I think a lot of people I'm attracting are people who are emerging from worldviews about conspiracy, about occultism, about psychedelics, about UFOs, whatever. They've gone into Chapel Perilous, they got lost, it got less and less fun, they were hanging by their nails on the tightrope, and they saw me. It was like, I don't know how to extend the metaphor exactly. I'd managed to cobble together a safety net before I plunged to my doom. And then I'm like, down here, you can get off the tightrope, and this is maybe the way out. Not sure yet, because I haven't made it out yet. But yeah, none of this is real because it's all been co-opted. But whatever drew you to it was real. And that's what I'm looking at, which is what you referred to earlier about how I can't remember, don't want to paraphrase, but I have to, like the dark, intense, psychological, traumatic underlayer of conspiracy theorizing that's there, that isn't being acknowledged. That's what I've been acknowledging more and more. And so the people who are drawn to that for the same reason and are willing to acknowledge it have been doing so. And so my circles become more and more populated by people who are conscious or half-conscious victims, to use a term I use with hesitation, of these programs. And so it's so real for them. It's so far from entertainment. And the stakes get so much higher, and the responsibility gets so much higher. And my commitment to not exposing, mapping and exploring and understanding the real conspiracy, and I won't put quotes there, because I think we do disagree there. I do think it's very intentional, very consciously organized. I just don't know how metaphysical we're talking. Like, we know there are, we know, you and I sense that there are metaphysical entities that mess with human beings and that can organize. I don't know, maybe that's elite for you, that part. But anyway, and we know that there are human conspiracies. So then there's this fuzzy area, how much is there an interpenetration between these worlds of metaphysical control and human control? Clearly there's a messy area where it's just complicity and incompetence and laziness and greed. But then clearly with something like MK Ultra, to use an easy, obvious example, there's really consciously organized, programs. And then when we go into the metaphysical world, it's not so fact-based, as I say, but you and I might both have an intuition that there is some kind of intense level of manipulation going on there. So, but in any event, it's kind of impossible to really map that, but the attempt itself seems to me to be a healing one. And that's what I've found, that people have found healing through sharing that journey of attempting to map the unmappable, and thereby putting their pain into a context that's real, that's more real than what we're being told.
Her wingless arms are moving lines, circling skies and wandering signs. Central trees are worrisome. Blessed is he that rests this song. She moves her arms.